All right, I just have one article for you today, and this is just showing how awesome Pete Buttigieg is. He's thoughtful, he actually understands nuance because he had a interview on Morning Edition on NPR. This is going to talk about it, but this is from The Advocate. And he talks about things like, trans girls in girls' sports, but unlike the transphobes who want to blanket things, and even the allies who seem to think that under no circumstances should we exclude trans people ever, under any circumstance. He takes a more nuanced approach, and it sounds like it's closer to my view, which is depends on the sport, depends on when the transition took place, and depends on so many factors that it isn't just simply, we shouldn't allow trans girls in women's sports. So, let's get to the article. Pete Buttigieg weighs in on fairness of transgender kids playing girls' sports. All right. Former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg offered one of the most carefully worded responses yet to the debate over transgender youth participation in sports on Monday morning in an NPR interview. The approach starts with compassion. Buttigieg, who is gay, told Morning Edition host Steve Inskeep. Now, this is something that bugs the hell out of me. What does his being gay have to do with anything in this regard? I mean, okay, he is a gay person who happens to support trans people. What does bringing up that he's gay actually contribute to this conversation? I would say nothing. Anyway, compassion for transgender people, compassion for families, especially of young people who are going through this, and also empathy for people who are not sure what all of this means for them. Exactly. I totally get why there are people who think that trans girls in girls' sports is unfair. I get it. For the most part, depending on what we're talking about, it's a matter of they don't understand what it means to be a trans person in women's sports, because again, it depends on the level, it depends on the sport, it depends where this person is in their transition and when they transition. So there's so much to consider. So I can understand, especially with people on mostly the Republican side, saying, blanketing it, all trans girls are this, all trans girls are that. And so, of course, it's going to scare cis girls into thinking that if there is a girl who happens to be particularly good, particularly strong, particularly big, that they must be trans. And it's just scaring people, and people just don't understand what it is that they should be dealing with. And of course, you feel for the trans kids who, maybe because of a certain condition, they cannot fairly compete with cis girls. And, that sucks. because you want to compete. Or it could be a matter of they just happen to feel like they're being othered simply because they're trans. So there is so much that we have to consider that one side or the other seems to forget the other part. We have to think about trans people and how they feel, but we also can't forget how cis people feel. Now, I'm not talking about the changing room because I've mentioned many times before, this isn't about comfort. I never felt comfortable in the changing room, no matter what. Doesn't mean that I deserve to have a single changing room just for me because I didn't feel comfortable. Because probably more likely none of the girls felt comfortable. And, that's just the way it is. Some people are okay with it, some people aren't. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the actual competition because that's where, people will feel, oh, I'm being disadvantaged, or I'm being othered. So there is something to be said for the particular sport. But again, it's nuanced. When did this girl transition? How long have they been on hormones? It's just so much nuance that you can't just blanket either side. You can't say that cis women have nothing to say about trans women being in sports, but they also need to do it with some nuance as to the circumstance. Anyway, moving on. Asked whether a parent concerned about their child facing a trans kid in girls' sports has a case, Buttigieg said, "Sure, but he rejected blanket policies like the federal bans being enacted by the Trump administration, saying these decisions should be in the hands of sports leagues and school boards and not politicians. Least of all, politicians in Washington trying to use this as a political pawn." Absolutely. This is 100% correct. It's 1,000% correct. I mean, this is what I've been saying all along. There have been states, there have been communities that try to attack sports leagues for daring to not ban trans women. Simply because they want a blanket ban on trans people because they're not concerned so much about fairness in sports, but they just don't want trans people to exist. But, like I said, there are certain sports where, depending on when the trans girl transitioned, that they might have a case that there is an unfair advantage. And we do have to look into that. But that's not for politicians to look into. That is for sports leagues where you would hope that they are actually looking at the science and not just a knee-jerk reaction that trans girls bad. Okay. Buttigieg's remarks came days after Rahm Emanuel, former President Joe Biden's ambassador to Japan, former mayor of Chicago, and a potential 2028 presidential candidate, told Megyn Kelly that a man can't become a woman. Okay. A comment that directly contradicted party orthodoxy and sparked fresh divisions over how Democrats should approach transgender rights. Okay. Now, in one case, he's right. A man cannot become a woman because that's a gender. And people who are born male, probably if they felt like a girl the entire time, and they just might not have self-identified as a girl for whatever reason, either because they were still figuring out whether it's true, or because they are surrounded by asshats. There's so many reasons why you might have been born male but feel like you are a girl. That you can do. And so, yeah, technically, if you want to be like that, or if you're talking about biology, like people bring up chromosomes. Well, if we know for a fact that someone has XX chromosomes and they feel like they are a man, obviously they're not changing their chromosomes. They're not idiots. They don't think that they're doing that. They understand how biology works. If they didn't, they wouldn't need to transition because that wouldn't make sense. So, in a sense, he's right because people might they know who they are. They know what their gender is, and they might be identifying as a man. And even though they feel like a woman the entire time, and they're just comfortable enough to eventually bring that out, or vice versa. So I guess sort of like, a gay person can't become straight. Well, or vice versa. A straight person can't become gay. Technically, it's true. It's just a matter of them learning more about themselves and accepting who they are as opposed to changing. So, if you look at it that way, yeah. All right. I think most reasonable people would recognize that there are serious fairness issues if you just treat this as not mattering when a trans athlete wants to compete in women's sports, Buttigieg told NPR. The political stakes are high. A June 2025 Gallup poll found that 69% of U.S. adults believe trans athletes should only be allowed to play on teams matching their gender assigned at birth, including 91% of Republicans, 66% of independents, and 45% of Democrats. Support for transgender athletes' inclusion has declined steadily since Gallup first asked the question in 2021. Since returning to the Oval Office in January, President Donald Trump has signed executive orders eliminating federal recognition of gender identity, banning trans military service, restricting access to gender-affirming care, and prohibiting transgender girls and women from playing on female sports teams. The United States Supreme Court will weigh in on the legalities of banning transgender people from sports by next summer. The court has agreed to hear 2 cases involving transgender athletes next term, which begins in October. LGBTQ+ rights groups have warned that such bans are not only discriminatory, but also dangerous. A July 2025 fact sheet from GLAAD noted that fewer than 10 transgender student athletes are competing among the NCAA's 510,000 athletes. It also pointed to documented cases of cisgender girls being falsely accused of being trans, harassed, or subjected to invasive screening, consequences not limited to trans youth. Exactly. Like I said, this anti-trans fever this furor is causing people to transvestigate everybody. If you're a tall woman who's extremely strong, then people will assume you were born a man. Now, in that case, the entire Wisconsin Badger volleyball team, especially from a couple years ago, must have been born male because they're all very tall. And, well, most of them are very tall. The liberos, no, not so much. They're very tall and they're super strong, especially those who spike. Those people, those women are insanely strong. You cannot judge women by, oh, they must have been born male because they're stronger than average women. Because there's a reason why we use the term average. There are going to be women who are above average in strength and height. There are going to be women with below average. I mean, if you would see me, you would know that I am what once upon a time would have been called a midget. Not a dwarf, because I do not have dwarfism. My extremities are not disproportionately short. But I am what once upon a time would have been called a midget and now a little person. Simply because I'm not even 5 feet. But that doesn't say anything about my gender identity. It doesn't say anything about who I am as a person. It just mentions that I am short. Okay. And there are women who are extremely tall. We have, or had, I think she graduated, on the Wisconsin Badgers volleyball team, we had a woman who's 6'6". We've had another one who's 6'8". That doesn't mean that they weren't born female. Just means that they are extremely tall. Because that's the thing. Just because you were born that you grew up to be a certain height doesn't say anything about your gender identity. It just says that you grew up to be a certain height. Maybe your parents were extremely tall. In my case, both my parents are extremely short. Not as short as me, but short. So, genetics. So we cannot go by that to determine who is male and who is female. I watched Daredevil. There is an actor who plays Buck Cashman. I looked up his height. He's 5'8". Okay. So he's a short guy. That doesn't say anything about what gender he identifies as. I mean, why should it? Gymnasts, male gymnasts. There's one male gymnast who's like 5'2" on the latest U.S. Olympic team. Okay. That's considered short even for women. The average woman, I think, is what, 5'4"? That doesn't say anything about the fact that he is male. It doesn't say anything about whether he was born female or male. You have no reason to assume that just because he's short. You expect a gymnast to be short. Those are the ones who do well in gymnastics. Because, duh, that's how gymnastics works. So, yeah, you can't just assume that because they're strong or that stronger than average or that they're taller than average, that must mean something. Yeah, it means that they were born to do that particular sport because they're naturally gifted for that. It doesn't mean literally anything else. Okay, so let's move on. In March, California Governor Gavin Newsom, a fellow Democrat, received harsh backlash for telling far-right operative Charlie Kirk that trans kids' participation in sports is deeply unfair. Again, which sport are we talking about? And which trans kids? Because again, everything is very nuanced. It is not cookie cutter. You cannot just blanket say that all trans kids, which I can only assume he means trans girls, because again, trans boys seem to be pushed by the wayside. But which girls are we talking about? Those who transitioned prior to reaching puberty, or those who went through male puberty? We're not talking about the same thing. What sports are we talking about? Because there is literally nothing. Like, I recently did a article about a trans woman who people in Germany lost their absolute minds because she's trans, competing in a women's only chess tournament. It's fucking chess. There is no advantage. There is no locker room that they go back to. There is literally nothing to fear from someone who's trans in chess. And if you are playing chess against only women because men intimidate you, why? Why is it that you only want to play chess against women? Because I do not understand why that sport is gendered to begin with, because you're either have what it takes to play chess or you don't. There isn't anything inherent in men that makes them better at chess. I do not understand this idea that, oh, women just feel more comfortable. Is that so? Or is this just so more people can participate? Which, if that's the case, to allow more participation, then fine. I get that. But because they feel more comfortable, I don't know. Are there male chess players that are that intimidating that they literally threaten you? I mean, there might be. I've heard of all sorts of stupid shit that goes on with the men, but that has nothing to do with you as a woman. And I'm sure that they have security. So, I don't know. Anyway, pressed on Trump's repeated slogan, no boys and girls sports, which there aren't boys and girls sports, Buttigieg declined to echo the rhetoric. I think that chess is different from weightlifting, and weightlifting is different from volleyball, and middle school is different from the Olympics, he said. So that's exactly why I think that we shouldn't be grandstanding on this as politicians. We should be empowering communities, organizations, and schools to make the right decisions. Yes. Why aren't more people saying this? My God. I mean, this is what I've been saying whenever this topic comes up. It's not the same. The sports are not the same. So, and he hasn't gotten into the fact that it also depends on when the trans girl transitioned. Was it pre-puberty, post-puberty? How long has she been on hormones? Because that's also a thing, especially if it's post-puberty. How long has this girl been on hormones? Because I don't know how much of an advantage, and maybe there is initially some advantage once they go through male puberty, but the more that they're on hormones, maybe highly likely the lesser of an advantage they have. So, did they have bottom surgery? Because that's a big influx of testosterone, even if you're on hormones. So, obviously, that's a factor. And he didn't even, maybe he goes into it later, but. So that is the end of that article, but I am going to post the link to this article because it also sends you to YouTube, and you can watch the entire Morning Edition interview with Pete Buttigieg. So if you're so inclined, you can do that. I believe I've covered everything I wanted to in this video. So with that, I will see you guys in the next video.